There's an old phrase, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. The saying may be well-worn, but it helps tell a story along the Oregon-California border, the story of the Klamath Water Wars.
They didn't think about the future. They didn't think about what was going to happen after the dams.
Conservation groups, commercial fishermen, and Klamath tribes have been fighting for the protection of fish and removal of dams on the Klamath River for decades to let the river flow as it once did.
By building the dams and by taking the water away, they took our fish. Fish is our life, especially on the Klamath River, our life and our culture. My goal is to fight for those fish and keep fighting for them until I can't find any more.
But some farmers, ranchers, and residents who live near the dams worry a changed river will make it harder to get enough water in the drought-stricken region.
I don't think that in a year like this, the river should be running bank full, and I don't think that my farm should be getting zero irrigation water.
You either got to stand up and take it, or you're not going to ever have water here again. We've been trying to be nice, but we're getting to the end of the rope now.
The story of the Klamath Water Wars may seem like an old Western, but just like how those Hollywood narratives were always too simple, there's a lot more than just fish versus farms going on here. And now, 4 of the dams on the Klamath are coming out, reopening the basin to salmon and restoring thousands of acres of land. It's giving some along the river new hope and leaving others uncertain. From the newsroom of OPB, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Today, we're bringing you the history behind the largest dam removal project in United States history. Why the dams were created in the first place, who controls the flow, and how residents of the basin are waiting to see how the dam removals will reshape the landscape. Cassandra Perfida is an editor and reporter at OPB. She's been covering the Klamath Dam removal project for years and joins us to break down the story. Cassandra, thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Hi, Jen.
Hi. So let's start at the very beginning. In the early 1900s, as part of the Klamath Project, the federal government drained the lower Klamath Lake and wetlands in southern Oregon and put in irrigation canals. They also started building dams on the Klamath River as it flows out to the sea in northern California. Can you give us a sense of what the entire Klamath Basin was like or known for before all of the dams were built?
Yeah. So people describe the basin in those early days as the Everglades of the West.
Ooh.
It was just full of wetlands. There were almost 500,000 acres of wetlands in the upper basin, and it was globally unique. This is a river system where the wetlands were all at the top of the river system, and there was none at the bottom. The wetlands really did a great job of filtering water, keeping it clean, creating habitat for all kinds of fish and wildlife. And then these federal projects came in and kind of redesigned and replumbed that system. They drained 2 big lakes and eliminated about 90% of those wetlands.
Wow.
A lot of the work was done by the Bureau of Reclamation, and it was considered reclaiming the land for farming. And at the time, the federal government considered it great progress to turn this waterlogged land into farms and communities with irrigation to grow food and new ways to make money. And the dams helped to store and direct the water and gave these communities the electricity that they needed to develop and thrive. But of course, if you talk with the indigenous communities, whose ancestors lived in the basin historically,
right,
they have a totally different view of those wetlands and what was lost when the dams were built. They got tons of food from the wetlands. There were these wetland plants where they gathered woka seeds that are like a superfood. They have tons of nutrients. And then they ate suckerfish from the lakes and the wetlands that were drained. And then, of course, back then there were salmon.
Yeah. So how did all of these changes that came about from these projects affect the salmon population on the river?
Well, the salmon used to swim all the way up the Klamath River from the ocean, and the dams in Northern California blocked them. In California, there was no requirement to build a way for the fish to swim around the dams. And so it's been more than 100 years since Southern Oregon has seen salmon in the upper Klamath River. The salmon, steelhead, and lamprey were all blocked from accessing about 400 miles of habitat by those dams.
Wow. Yeah. So we're talking about the salmon populations on the Klamath River. The salmon are there, of course, but there's another important fish species to think about here, suckerfish that live in Upper Klamath Lake. And these fish are important for the tribes that live above the dams in the upper basin. Can you tell us more about the Chewam and Koptu?
Yeah, the Chewam and Koptu are also known as the Lost River and Short Nose suckerfish.
Okay.
They are important first foods for the tribes in the Upper Klamath Basin, and they've been listed as endangered since 1988. Their numbers started declining when the government drained a lot of the lakes and wetlands that they live in. And there's a huge effort to save those fish. You know, they're being raised in hatcheries and reared in the basin. But, you know, they really need healthy wetland habitat and clean water. And there's a lot of signs that they're not recovering. So there's just a lot of concern that whatever we've done so far hasn't done enough to recover these fish.
Yeah, I mean, after dams and irrigation systems were built in the Klamath Basin, the federal government offered this newly drained land to World War I veterans and white homesteaders to farm with the idea that water would be plentiful. They also signed a treaty preserving the water rights of tribes to keep the suckerfish we've been talking about alive. Now the salmon and the suckerfish are protected as endangered species, and there's a national wildlife refuge here for migrating bird species as well. How has having so many different interests and parties at play complicated debates and decisions made around water in this region?
I mean, it really ends up pitting all these different interests against each other, unfortunately. It means that some years farmers don't get the irrigation water that they need because the Endangered Species Act requires their water to stay in Upper Klamath Lake and the Klamath River to protect fish. Last year, it meant that the wildlife refuge didn't get any water. So a lot of the wetlands that migratory birds use every year, they were completely dry.
Wow.
And the birds really had no reason to stop there. And so I saw recently that the Klamath Water Wings Birding Festival is canceled this year.
Oh, no.
Yeah, because there's just not enough water in the refuge to support the birds. Most people would agree that, you know, water in the basin has been over-allocated, promised to too many people. And that means, you know, some of those people can't get the water that they've been promised during drought years. The salmon and suckerfish all have these legal requirements under the Endangered Species Act for how much water they need to survive and recover. And it's created this kind of tug-of-war situation where a certain amount of water needs to stay in the Upper Klamath Lake for the suckers, and a certain amount needs to go downstream for the coho salmon. And then, like, there's this question of, like, what does that leave for the, you know, farmers who are trying to make a living by growing crops like alfalfa that need water? It gets really complicated. And then on top of that, recently, you know, the Klamath tribes have been recognized as having the most senior water right.
Right.
And so they have this really high priority over other water users, and they care a lot about recovering the salmon and the Chewam and Koptu.
Okay, even with all of that, water issues didn't really come into severe conflict in the region until 2001. That year, there was a deep drought, and federal officials, like, you know, some of what you were talking about, federal officials cut off water for farmland in the Upper Klamath Basin. And to be clear, that water comes from Upper Klamath Lake above where the dams currently being removed are located. And the government's reason for cutting off irrigation water had to do with the Endangered Species Act. So can you explain a bit more how the act has come into play in this region and why it is so significant to this story?
Yeah, 2001 was a rough year. There was a terrible drought, so there wasn't a lot of water to go around. And the Endangered Species Act legally required that a certain amount of water stayed in the river and in Upper Klamath Lake for the fish. So the federal government cut off the water for the irrigators in the Upper Klamath Basin because diverting it to the farms would have violated the Endangered Species Act and harmed these protected fish. Farmers faced this stark reality that this law posed a real threat to their livelihood.
We've been trying to be nice, but we're getting to the end of the rope now. You just go in there and pull the bulkheads and open the head gates and get it going.
And they pushed back in this massive protest and formed this famous bucket brigade, where thousands of people lined up with buckets to move water from the river into the empty irrigation canal.
So at this point, as we've been talking about, different groups are asserting their different kinds of rights to water when there's not enough water to go around. What was life like between neighbors around this time?
I think this is when we got into the worst of the water wars. Everyone started realizing that they would have to fight to get their share of the water. And it did mean, fighting their neighbors in some cases. There's a lot of tension between farmers and ranchers and Native American tribes. And, it's kind of because of the way the federal government replumbed the basin, that really pitted their interests against each other. The government had invited farmers and ranchers to settle in the basin and promised them water from this massive irrigation project. And they had built families and communities around that promise for generations. But, of course, that promise also scrambled the ecosystem and in the whole Klamath Basin, and it put the salmon and the suckerfish in this downward spiral. And these fish they're essential to indigenous cultures. Tribal members believe that their own survival depends on the survival of these species. So in a sense, you had these two cultures both fighting for their survival in this basin.
Yeah. So the year after irrigation was cut off to farmers and irrigators in the region, the Bush administration reversed its decision and sent water back to farmers. And what happened next in 2002 was one of the biggest fish kills in the history of the West. Tens of thousands of salmon died from disease and rotted on the banks, all because the river's flow wasn't deep or fast enough. After this devastating event, how did things change for the debate around water in the basin?
Yeah, that fish kill really mobilized all of the tribes and environmental advocates in the basin to take serious action. For them, seeing thousands of dead fish in the river was just too much to bear.
Yeah.
So they got organized and they started actually traveling and staging protests to fight for dam removal. At first, that meant going to Scotland to confront the owners of Scottish Power that owned the four dams. And then that company actually sold the dams to Pacific Corp, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. So then they were traveling around the U.S. to shareholders meetings and kind of asking Warren Buffett to remove the dams to save salmon. By then, everyone recognized that, resolving the water conflicts in the Klamath would take more than dam removal. So there was a group of stakeholders from all these different groups that started meeting to negotiate this big agreement. The agreement that they finally made was called the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, was finalized in 2010. And, it called for not only removing the four dams, but also spending a very large sum of money on environmental restoration, giving farmers some guarantees that they would get a certain amount of water, and also providing the Klamath tribes with some land. It was a really big deal, but it required the approval of Congress, and that approval never came. That meant that it expired. The agreement expired before Congress approved it, and that left a lot of the basin's water issues unresolved. They did manage to salvage the plans to remove the dams under this companion agreement, and it's called the Klamath Hydrologic Settlement Agreement. And then they went a different route to get that agreement approved without Congress's involvement. And so now the dams are coming out, but these other water disputes are still unresolved.
Okay, so fast forward a bit to a few years ago. In 2021, the Klamath Basin faced one of the worst droughts on record. And as a result of the water crisis, many farmers in the basin were unable to irrigate portions of their land. At the time, one of the farmers OPB talked to was Ben Duval, an alfalfa farmer. He received his land from his grandfather, who got it in the 1940s as part of the homestead drawing after World War II. He told our colleagues at Think Out Loud about there being too many, quote, competing demands on the water because everybody wants more.
I think we need to go back to a balanced approach. I don't think that in a year like this, the river should be running bank full, and I don't think that my farm should be getting zero irrigation water. I think that we need some balance in there, and we need to look at all the benefits that irrigated ag in this area provides to the communities, to the wildlife refuges, to the amount of private habitat that we ordinarily provide on our private lands.
So I noticed that he's talking about wanting a balanced approach to different water needs in the basin. How does that compare to what we saw when things came to a head 20 years earlier in 2001, 2002?
Yeah, so by 2021, a lot has changed in the legal and political dynamics in the Klamath Basin. Back in 2001, 2002, the decision to leave water for fish and let farms go dry was outrageous. And farmers acted on that outrage by trying to force the water into their irrigation canals. But that really didn't change the basic problem, and the requirements of the Endangered Species Act didn't go away. The fish still aren't recovered in 2021. And there were some activists who did threaten, to once again force the water into the irrigation canals, but they didn't go through with it. By 2021, the farmers found themselves in a pretty different position than they were before. There was an understanding that the dams would be removed without the rest of that agreement going forward that would have given farmers their guarantees. And so, dam removal had been this kind of leverage that brought everyone to the table and allowed them to negotiate a water sharing agreement.
Oh, I see.
And that, taking dam removal out of there kind of took that leverage away.
Oh, okay.
So by 2021, the farmers, they don't have any leverage. And when we talked to farmers in the basin last fall, they acknowledged it. They said, we're not in the driver's seat anymore, and we're kind of hanging on by our fingertips, to the bumper of the car, and just hanging on for dear life.
Right. Coming up after a short break, OPB science editor and reporter Cassandra Perfida tackles what led to the largest dam removal project in U.S. history and gives us a sense of how folks living along the Klamath River are preparing. So in 2024, several dams are in the process of coming out. After all these years, what ended up finally bringing this about, leading to the largest dam removal project in U.S. history? Was it the activism we've been hearing about? Was it money? Was it both?
I think it might depend on who you ask. PacifiCorp has pretty much said it was a matter of money. Environmental laws required the company to install fish ladders so that salmon could swim around the dams. And that was going to be very expensive.
Really expensive, yeah.
Removing the dams was actually the cheaper option for the utility. But of course, this wasn't about money for the tribes. Without their activism, there wouldn't have been the same kind of pressure on PacifiCorp and the state and federal governments to find a way to cover the full cost of removing the dams and restoring the river. This is a $500 million project.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Super expensive. And PacifiCorp's ratepayers are only paying for about half of that cost. So the states of Oregon and California are footing the rest of the bill. And for all these things to come together the way they did, it was kind of like a messy combination of, all kinds of things, including environmental distress that was undeniable after that massive fish kill.
Right. It's right there in plain view. Yeah, exactly. So lately, you've been hearing from folks about how they're preparing for the final dams to come out this year. What has that been like for residents living along the Klamath River right now?
Yeah, this is creating a muddy mess and a lot of uncertainty for people who live along the Klamath River. There are people whose water wells have run dry as the dam's reservoirs have been drained over the last month. People who have property along the reservoirs now have this kind of unsightly and potentially unstable mud wall next to their homes, and they're not really sure who's going to own that land in the future. It might end up going to the Shasta Indian Nation, which has asked for it. They want to get this land back after dam removal is through. I went to Copco Lake with Sammy Jo Diffentorum, who is with the Shasta tribe, and she talked about how important this area is to her people who currently have no land of their own.
We have a lot of things that are submerged as a result of the dams and the land being taken. Our people were displaced, families, villages that have been really hard to patch together over the years, but we also do have ceremony sites here. The site of our salmon ceremony is here. So, I think that there is a real positive future here for the tribe with culture and having some of our historic practices and ceremonies back. And so we're looking forward to that returning, for future generations. I look at my little grandsons and it's like, they deserve to have culture, to have ceremony, and to have tradition.
So if the Shasta end up getting their land back, essentially they're going to be the new neighbors to people who used to live next to Copco Lake. And so a lot is changing for the people who live along this stretch of the river. And so there's a lot of uncertainty all around about what's to become of this land now that it's not a lake anymore.
So with all of this change to the landscape, a lot of restoration work needs to happen on the land in this area, and some of it has started already. What are workers with local tribes doing to repair the more than 2,000 acres around the reservoirs and dams?
Well, a group of workers with the Yurok tribe has spent the last year gathering what I just learned was 98 species of native plants.
Oh, wow.
So that they can be planted in these empty reservoirs. I think they collected something like 17 billion seeds.
Wow.
Like, it was just like millions and billions and so many of everything.
Yeah.
So now they're spending their days planting these seeds and the plants that were propagated from them. So they took some of the seeds and they grew the plants, and now they're going back and they're filling the reservoirs with native plants. It's a huge job. But, we followed them around, and they're all very excited to be doing this work. We talked with their crew leader, Alana Grant, at the beginning of this work.
It feels like I'm really making a difference with this type of job. We're working right now to get these invasive species out of the way so we can give the native plants a fighting chance to grow and do good.
They were still doing the tedious task of mowing all the invasive species along the reservoir to make sure they wouldn't take over when the reservoir was drained.
Okay, so it sounds like there is a lot of work in preparation for this underway. And meanwhile, dam removal itself is a massive job. But the hard part of this project won't be over when the dams are out. It won't be an outright cure for water issues in the basin, right?
No. Nope. Dam removal is far from a cure from all the water issues in the basin. What dam removal will do is reopen those 400 miles of habitat for salmon, which could help recover the threatened species of coho. It'll restore more natural flows to the river. It eliminates the unnaturally warm, stagnant water that was hanging out in those reservoirs. And that was inviting these toxic algae blooms, these diseases and parasites that were proliferating in the river and really hurting the fish. Mm-hmm. Better water quality will absolutely help the struggling species of fish. And that could make the fights over water a little less dire in the future. None of this changes the basic problem that there's not enough water in the Klamath River to satisfy all the needs of the people who need it. Mm-hmm. However, there is an encouraging new development that was recently announced. The federal government is putting about $72 million towards restoration projects in the Klamath. And the farmers and the tribes have signed a new agreement that says they're going to work together on how to spend that money in ways that will improve water quality and water supply reliability for the fish, the wildlife, and irrigation.
Yeah. Okay, one of the dams has already come out. The other dams are set to be removed in 2024, possibly by September. Earlier this year, for example, you were there to watch the process begin at the J.C. Boyle Dam, where a hole was blasted in the dam wall. So what's the next part of this story you're looking into, Cassandra?
Well, the next big thing is the demolition of the 3 remaining dams. That's scheduled to start in late May, June-ish.
Okay.
And in the meantime, there's a lot of planting going on in the reservoir. So that's going to be fun to see as these millions of plants grow and turn all these muddy reservoirs into riverbanks lined with native plants. And, it's also coming up on springtime. So I'm really hoping that enough salmon will show up that we can go fishing with some of the tribal members. I got to follow some of the scientists who are essentially seeding the next salmon run that they hope to see start up in southern Oregon. And I went with them as they released a bunch of juvenile salmon into a stretch of the river above the dams that hasn't seen salmon in over a century. And it was a very emotional experience for Klamath tribal member Charlie Wright, who is working as a fish tech.
Charlie, do you want to come grab these fish?
Yeah, so I talk to them a lot because I feel that connection with them. They are like our babies, and there is that connection there. And it's not just me. There's a lot of fisheries people who feel the same way. They're literally our babies. We've cared for them in these past years, so to return them is just an awesome feeling. And I talk to the fish all the time, not just when I release them, when I'm caring for them too, so.
She and other scientists are hoping that some of the salmon that they released will actually be able to swim all the way down the river now and out to the ocean. Once the dams are out, there's going to be a clear path for them. And so they're thinking, well, maybe they might swim all the way out there and swim all the way back up a free-flowing Klamath River and start the next generation of salmon. Wow. So it's a really big hope, and it's been a really long time since that was even possible.
Wow, such a time of change, and I'm so looking forward to you being able to follow these changes from here on out. Cassandra, thank you so much for walking us through this history of the Klamath Dams and Basin and how they're affecting communities along the river today.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
But it was my pleasure.
Thank you. That was OPB science editor and reporter Cassandra Profita. We'll drop links to some of her reporting on the Klamath Dam removal in our show notes. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. Join us next week when we'll bring you the voices of some of the indigenous people in the Klamath Basin. If you're here listening right now, you are part of our brand new podcast family. Help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. Follow us there, and hey, tell your friends. Mia Estrada produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The rest of the OPB podcast team includes Julie Sabatier and Sage Van Wing. Cassandra Profita, Stephanie Gordon, Brandon Swanson, and Dave Miller did the interviews you heard. Sound bites from farmers protesting in 2001 came from CNN and KGW. If you ever have a question for us, by the way, please reach out. Email us at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.